Imagine standing on the dusty, windswept coast of Boca Chica, Texas. On one side, you have the Starship, a gleaming 400-foot stainless steel cathedral of engineering, the most powerful machine ever built, poised to literally carry human consciousness to the stars. It represents the end of scarcity, the mining of asteroids, and the survival of our species. But the machine is cold. It sits silent on the pad. If you look down at the sand near the launch site, you'll find the reason why. It's a snowy plover, a small, unassuming seabird sitting on a nest, and standing between that bird and the rocket is a man in a suit from the FAA holding a clipboard. It creates this surreal, almost comedic tableau of modern stagnation. We have the technology to break the cradle of Earth, to escape the zero-sum game of a closed system that creates wars and famine. But we aren't launching. Instead, we are drowning in over 19,000 public comments and environmental impact statements, paralyzed by a bureaucracy that treats a few broken windows or a disturbed patch of sand as a catastrophe equal to the extinction of humanity. This isn't just a delay, it's an upgraded, real-life version of the trolley problem. The regulatory state has its hand on the lever. On one track, you have a few birds. On the other, you have the entire future of the human race. And with a righteous, safety-obsessed smile, they are choosing the birds. They call it environmental protection. But when you look at the math of a dying, closed-system planet, it looks a lot more like planetary-level suicide. Okay, so that opening monologue, which, we took directly from a viewpoint in our source material, uses some very, very charged framing, extremely charged.
Oh, absolutely. Planetary level suicide is not pulling any punches.
Not at all. But it throws us right into the core conflict we really need to get into today. This tension between, on one hand, this need for humanity to grow, to expand, and on the other, all this regulatory friction that is, quite literally grounding our future.
It's the perfect image for it. The irresistible force of technology meeting the immovable object of bureaucracy.
Exactly. So our mission in this deep dive is, it's threefold. First, we've got to unpack the philosophical side of it, but also the hard economic arguments for why we must leave the cradle. We'll get into the math of scarcity.
Then we'll dig into the hurdles, the bureaucratic and ideological barriers. We'll look at the FAA and this concept of safetyism that keeps coming up.
And finally, and this is the really exciting part, we'll get into the hard engineering that actually makes all this possible. The breakthroughs that are changing the entire game, shifting us from what our sources call a mass paradigm to a cost paradigm. It's really a look at what happens when exponential growth physics meets, institutional paperwork.
It's an analysis of a huge pivot point in history, really. We're looking at this transition of heavy industries off-world as an economic necessity, not just a cool idea. It's about overcoming resource scarcity. We'll examine how regulation is hitting the brakes on all of it and what an industrial-scale, ultra-low-cost launch system actually looks like.
So let's start with that first big question, the existential one, the absolute necessity of expansion. This idea isn't new, right? It goes back to the very beginning, to Konstantin Tsiolkovsky.
That's right. He had that famous quote, "Earth is the cradle of humanity, but one cannot live in a cradle forever."
It's a beautiful line, but what's the actual science and economics behind it? Why can't we just stay here? Why can't we just manage things better on Earth?
Well, Tsiolkovsky's insight, it's really rooted in the fundamental laws of physics. For all practical purposes, Earth is a closed system.
A closed system, meaning what goes in and what comes out is fixed.
Almost. We get energy from the sun, of course, but the material resources, the stuff we use to build things, that's all finite. And, more importantly, we're stuck with the second law of thermodynamics, entropy.
Right, the idea that everything tends towards disorder and decay unless you pump energy in to stop it.
Exactly. And on a planet with a finite amount of stuff and a finite energy budget, continuous exponential growth is just mathematically impossible. It can't happen forever.
Okay, so if you take human innovation and prosperity, which are basically driven by exponential growth, and you force that engine into a closed, finite box, what happens? What's the result of that?
The result is a really interesting phenomenon called involution.
Involution.
Yeah. Since you can't have true open-ended expansion anymore, physically or economically, all that human effort, it turns inward. It becomes desperate. It becomes zero-sum.
So instead of creating new things, you're just fighting over what's already there.
Precisely. Instead of baking a bigger pie, everyone is just fighting for a bigger slice of a shrinking pie.
Can you give us some concrete examples? What does that involution look like in the real world we live in?
Look at history. It's filled with resource wars, fighting over oil fields, fighting over farmland, conflicts over water rights. These are all tangible outcomes of that shrinking resource pie.
And today?
Today, on a more systemic level, you see it in these paralyzing political fights over things like carbon credits or trade disputes where one country is trying to get a tiny advantage over another. These aren't necessarily moral failings, they're structural symptoms. You've got billions of people who all want to grow and improve their lives, but they're stuck in a system that physically cannot support that indefinitely.
And the result of that constant struggle is, I guess, a complete rewiring of what we expect from society, from the future.
Absolutely. When expansion stops, the default philosophy becomes about managing decline. You see it everywhere. We're told, subtly or not so subtly, to lower our expectations for the next generation.
The push for synthetic everything, rationing.
Right? Rationing, accepting limitations. A lot of this gets wrapped up in environmental movements that are basically advocating for stasis. They're trying to sell the idea that living inside this rigid cage is the safest, most moral option. But if you play that tape forward, staying in the cradle, stuck with finite resources and guaranteed entropy, well, it's a guaranteed game over for humanity as a complex civilization.
This philosophical point brings us straight to the modern vision for space, especially the one championed by figures like Jeff Bezos. He argues this isn't about escaping a dying planet. It's about protecting a living one.
Bezos' proposal is very specific. He says we should systematically move all heavy, polluting, energy-intensive industries off of Earth and into space. The goal is to preserve Earth as this beautiful gem of a planet.
So manufacturing, power plants, mining, anything that takes a huge toll on the biosphere, just move it.
Move it. And a lot of this thinking wasn't just an economic calculation. It's really tied to that profound psychological shift that astronauts talk about, the overview effect.
Ah, yes. When you see the Earth from space and it changes your perspective.
It's a critical piece of the context. It's a cognitive shift. People who've seen it describe this overwhelming sense of connection, but also a shocking realization of how fragile it all is. Bezos himself has said that when you see it from orbit, you realize how tiny it is and how fragile it is. He specifically talks about how thin the atmosphere is.
Just that tiny blue line.
The tiny blue line. And that realization is what fuels this belief that heavy industry is just fundamentally mismatched with such a delicate system. It belongs somewhere else.
And if we actually pull this off, the payoff is, well, it's basically the end of scarcity as a concept.
The potential is staggering. You could have limitless clean energy from huge solar arrays in orbit, outside the atmosphere where they're way more efficient. And maybe more importantly, you get access to all the raw materials in the solar system.
Asteroid mining.
Asteroid mining could unlock more metals, more minerals, more resources than we have ever extracted in the entire history of humanity on Earth. It completely changes the math. It turns the closed system into an open-ended, non-zero-sum game.
That is an incredibly powerful vision. But we have to be fair here and address the counter-argument, the skeptical view that warns against this whole path.
Right, and this is often called the anti-distraction argument. It's articulated really well by philosophers like Roman Krznaric. He uses this analogy of the good mountaineer.
The good mountaineer, what's the idea there?
The core idea is that you have to secure and optimize base camp Earth before you even think about attempting the risky, ambitious peak of space colonization.
So it's not that going to space is inherently bad, it's that focusing on it right now is a dangerous distraction. It pulls resources and talent away from solving urgent problems here, the climate crisis being the big one.
Precisely. The risk is that we spend all this capital, all this brainpower, building a railroad to the stars while we completely neglect the fires burning at home. This viewpoint says we first have to learn to live sustainably within our planet's boundaries. It's about stewardship of what we have, not using space as an escape hatch.
And it's not just a philosophical debate. Planetary scientists raise some pretty serious technical hurdles about the timeline for all this.
Yeah, they look at the current state of the tech and they ask, are we really ready to do this in a human lifetime? The key technology for all of this is what's called in-situ resource utilization, or ISRU.
ISRU, that's basically living off the land, right? Using resources you find on the moon or Mars.
Exactly. Pulling water, ice, oxygen, metals from the lunar regolith or from asteroids.
Yeah.
And that tech is really, really in its infancy. For example, you have NASA's MOXIE experiment on the Perseverance rover.
The one making oxygen on Mars.
Right. It's an amazing proof of concept. But planetary science professors will tell you that scaling up from omoxi, which makes a few grams of oxygen, to something that can support a full-scale metal foundry or a self-sustaining habitat. That's a gigantic leap. It requires massive breakthroughs in robotics and automated construction and off-world power. The skeptics say the timeline of a few decades is just wildly optimistic given where the tech is today.
And from a purely economic view, does the cost-benefit analysis even work right now for moving industry into space?
That's a critical question. An astrodynamics expert, Dr. Joan Pel Sanchez-Cortiel, he made the point that the upfront capital expenditure, the CapEx, to build all that orbital infrastructure might just outweigh the immediate benefit.
You mean it might be cheaper to just invest in cleaner tech here on Earth, like solar or advanced nuclear?
That's the argument. While launch is getting cheaper, building specialized space-based factories is still astronomically expensive compared to mass-produced stuff on Earth. So just moving a polluting factory into space to avoid pollution costs on Earth, that doesn't necessarily make economic sense today. It suggests the real driver has to be accessing new resources, not just externalizing pollution.
So the big takeaway from this first part is the physics of the closed system says we have to expand for long-term survival, but the actual timeline for doing that is a huge point of conflict between the engineers and the planetary science community.
That's the core tension. The existential need is crystal clear, but the technological reality suggests we are still at the very, very beginning of building the required infrastructure. And that makes the next part of our discussion, the regulatory friction, even more critical, because any delays now just compound exponentially down the line.
Okay, let's move from the why to the why not. From the necessity of expansion to the friction that's stopping it. And that dramatic scene at Boca Chica is the perfect example. We have the tech, we have the money, we have the motivation, but we're stopped by paperwork. This is where this idea of safetyism really comes into play.
Yeah, you hear this frustration from the engineers constantly. You have these brilliant problem solvers like the aerospace engineer Sarah mentioned in one of our sources who are literally solving problems in physics that people thought were impossible.
Designing engines, new materials, orbital mechanics.
All of it. And then that entire massive multi-billion-dollar effort gets stalled by a single administrative decision about a local environmental impact statement, a PDF about nesting habits. It's just this crushing weight of external risk aversion.
And it's not even just about astronaut safety. It's about preventing any kind of localized disruption. When Starship did its first big orbital test flight, the launch pad basically disintegrated.
That incident became the flashpoint. It was described as a volcano-like eruption of debris. Concrete chunks and sand flew everywhere, broke some windows in the nearby town of Port Isabel, and the legal challenges were immediate.
Groups like the Center for Biological Diversity sued the FAA, right?
They did, arguing the launch violated the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. From the expansionist viewpoint, this reaction is just a profound failure of scale. They see it as equating a local, temporary disruption, a messed up patch of sand and some debris, with the extinction-level catastrophe that a closed system guarantees in the long run.
But hold on, let's be careful here. Let's look at it from their side. The plaintiffs, the Center for Biological Diversity, they aren't trying to cause planetary suicide. What's their justification?
No, and that's a very important point for being impartial here. Their argument is that they're fulfilling their legal mandate. Their job is to protect vulnerable wildlife and critical habitats from corporate interests that want to create a sacrifice zone. They see the actions of the launch company as reckless prioritizing short-term profit over long-term ecological responsibility.
So for them, every single disturbed habitat, no matter how small, is a failure of stewardship.
And it sets a dangerous precedent for future industrial expansion, both on Earth and off. They're focused on conservation and ecological stability right now.
Okay, understood. But that context is exactly where this academic concept of safetyism comes in as a critique of the regulatory response to that pressure.
Yes. Safetyism, as it's defined in academic circles, is basically a belief system where safety, and this includes subjective things like emotional comfort and predictability, is treated as a sacred value.
Sacred value, meaning it trumps everything else.
It overrides all other practical and moral concerns. Progress, free inquiry, intellectual rigor, or in this case, the long-term survival of the species. The argument is that this mindset is what leads to regulatory paralysis.
And how does that mindset translate into the actual process of regulating spaceflight?
It turns into extreme, and you could say non-proportional, risk aversion. The entire focus shifts to preventing the absolute slightest possibility of localized temporary harm, like a single bird's nest, at the expense of even considering the strategic species-level benefit of moving faster. The critique is that the whole system is now designed to stop things from happening, because it's convinced that any immediate disruption is worse than the long-term invisible threat of just staying put. It fuels an anti-growth, decelerationist philosophy where the status quo, the closed system, is seen as the only safe option.
Let's get into the nuts and bolts of the structure that's creating all this friction. The FAA's Office of Commercial Space Transportation, or AST, what's their job and where does this tension come from?
Well, the FAA, AST, operates under this really difficult dual mandate. It's codified in the Commercial Space Launch Act of 1984. They are required to both regulate and promote commercial space launch.
Regulate and promote. Those two things sound like they're in direct conflict.
They're inherently contradictory. To regulate, they impose all these licensing requirements to assess risks to public health, safety, national security. But to promote, they're supposed to be encouraging the industry to grow.
And the license evaluation process itself it's a labyrinth, isn't it? 5 major components, and each one can basically veto the whole project.
That's right. When a company applies for a launch license for something new and ambitious like Starship, the FAA AST kicks off 5 parallel reviews. First is the safety review. It uses quantitative risk criteria to look at all the hazards to the public launch, re-entry, everything.
Okay, what are the second and third?
Second is the policy review. This is where the FAA has to go and talk to other federal agencies, especially the Department of Defense and the Department of State, to make sure the launch doesn't mess with national security or foreign policy. Third is the payload review, making sure the cargo itself is safe and doesn't violate any treaties.
And the fourth component is a big one that people often overlook, financial responsibility. What does an operator actually have to insure against?
They have to prove they have enough third-party liability insurance to cover what's called the maximum probable loss, or MPL.
Maximum probable loss.
It's a super complex calculation. They model the risk of debris, impact zones. Basically, MPL is the dollar figure for the worst case scenario if everything goes catastrophically wrong and damages property or people who aren't involved.
So for a brand new, untested rocket, figuring out that number must be incredibly subjective.
It is. And it gives the regulator massive leverage to delay things.
Yeah.
If they can't agree on the MPL or the company can't get insurance for that amount, no license.
And then the fifth component is the one that started this whole mess, the environmental review. And that's where this 180-day delay loop comes in.
Right. The environmental review is all about NEPA compliance, assessing every potential impact. By law, the FAA is supposed to approve or deny an application within 180 days after they officially accept it. But this is where the bureaucratic trick of tolling becomes so devastating.
Tolling.
The FAA regulations allow the agency to toll or pause the clock if they decide the application is missing sufficient information.
So the regulator can just say, nope, you haven't given us enough detail, and the 180-day countdown just freezes. They can just keep asking for more and more.
Precisely. It creates this endless administrative drag. They aren't technically denying the application, but they're perpetually delaying it. And this is how you end up in the situation our sources point out. The government's licensing process now takes longer than the actual design, manufacture, and physical construction of the rocket itself.
That's insane. The paperwork takes longer than building the machine.
Institutional paralysis. The focus on preventing every tiny risk, often by demanding these multi-year studies on every possible local impact, is what's threatening America's lead in commercial space.
So if that regulatory framework is the brake, we need to talk about what's been acting as the rocket fuel for this whole space renaissance we're in now, and that's deregulation and private sector efficiency. So why did progress stall for so long after Apollo?
It really boils down to a lack of market freedom. After the U.S. won the space race in '69, space just became this expensive government monopoly. It was all NASA and the Department of Defense.
And when the motivation is political, not economic, accountability just kind of disappears.
Yeah, it does. Central planning led to these spiraling costs and this deep, institutionalized aversion to risk. Once the geopolitical race was over, the political will to fund big, risky projects just dried up.
And the cost difference is the clearest proof of that inefficiency. I mean, government-run vehicles just became monumentally expensive.
Oh, just look at the numbers. The space shuttle was supposed to be reusable and bring costs down. But the cost to orbit was astronomical. It was around $29,000 per pound.
Which is about, what, $54,500 per kilogram to LEO?
An incredible number. And its successor, the government-developed SLS, the Space Launch System, it still costs around $19,500 per pound. For decades, spaceflight was just locked in this pattern. Super high cost, very low flight rate, and immense complexity.
And the most bitter irony in all of that stagnation is what happened to some truly pioneering projects that were just way ahead of their time, like the McDonnell Douglas Delta Clipper program.
Ah, the DCX. That program is a foundational tragedy for aerospace. It was a prototype for a single stage-to-orbit vehicle designed for full reusability and powered vertical landing.
The exact same technology that has revolutionized the launch industry today.
The exact same blueprint. Its prototype did the first powered vertical landing all the way back in 1993. That's 2 decades before commercial companies finally figured it out. But the program was transferred to NASA in 1996, and political priorities shifted.
An early test flight crashed, and they just killed it.
They canceled it. Instead of learning from the failure and iterating, which is what private industry does now, NASA just canceled it and moved on to other, less successful spaceplane concepts. And because NASA was the only game in town, that one cancellation just wiped out a decade of private innovation.
So commercial freedom was literally being strangled. Where did the change finally come from? What was the legislative breakthrough?
It was a gradual fight, really, over 2 decades. The foundation was the Commercial Space Launch Act of 1984. That was the first time the private sector's role was formally acknowledged. It gave private companies the freedom to launch, and crucially, it limited government regulation to only what was necessary for safety and national security.
But the government still held all the big contracts, right? Especially the military launches. That had to have held back private growth.
It did. It took some external shocks, like the Challenger disaster in '86, which grounded the shuttle fleet, and then the Launch Service Purchase Act in 1990, which forced the government to buy some launches from private companies. That's when NASA's monopoly really started to crack.
And then there was another big act in the late 90s.
Right, the Commercial Space Act of 1998. And this one was explicit. It declared that free and competitive markets should be the governing philosophy for the economic development of space. It basically made free market economics the official policy.
And the final wall to come down wasn't broken by Congress, it was broken in court.
The final monopoly was the one held by the United Launch Alliance, ULA, which is a joint venture between Boeing and Lockheed. They had these exclusive sole source contracts for all the military launches. So in 2014, SpaceX filed a huge lawsuit against the government, claiming they were being illegally shut out from bidding on these contracts.
Did they win?
The lawsuit was eventually dropped after the Air Force agreed to open up the competition, but the damage to the monopoly was done. It forced competitive bidding, and that immediately exposed the radically lower cost structure of the private companies. It opened up this massive river of defense money to actual market forces.
Okay, so now we can really quantify the result of that long push for freedom. Let's talk about the hard numbers of this cost collapse. The entire dream of space industrialization hangs on getting an exponential drop in the cost per kilogram to LEO.
And the numbers are just historic. Let's use the space shuttle as the high baseline at roughly $54,500 per kilogram.
So 54 grand, the first big step down was the reusable Falcon 9, a total game changer.
Once the Falcon 9 was fully reusable, it dropped the cost to an estimated $1,600 to $2,000 per kilogram.
Wait, from 54,000 down to 2,000?
Or less. That's already a staggering 27 to 34 times reduction compared to the shuttle. The Falcon Heavy, with its 3 reusable cores, got it down to about $1,400 per kilogram, a 39 times reduction. That's what made massive projects like the Starlink constellation even possible.
But the truly generational leap, the one that makes moving industry off-world plausible, is the target cost for Starship.
This is where it goes from linear improvement to exponential shift. The projections for Starship, assuming high reusability, they're targeting something like 20 to 70 flights per vehicle. They're aiming for an operational cost of $13 to $32 per kilogram.
$13 from 54,000.
If they hit that, it's a 1,700 to 4,200-fold reduction compared to the space shuttle. And their aspirational, their marginal goal is as low as $10 to $20 per kilogram. At $10 a kilo, you are looking at a 5,450-fold reduction in cost.
I mean, think about that. You're going from paying more than the price of gold per kilogram to paying about the price of air freight. That kind of disruption can't just be one thing. What are the key engineering and economic choices that make a 4,000x reduction even possible?
There are 3 critical interconnected drivers. First, obviously, is maximum reusability. Starship is designed for full and rapid reusability, both the booster and the ship.
So you can fly it again quickly, like an airplane.
That's the goal. Target up to 100 flights per vehicle. That amortizes the huge development costs over a massive amount of payload. If you can refuel it and fly it again in hours or days, the cost per launch just plummets.
Okay, so reusability is number one. Number two is just raw scale. These are super heavy lift vehicles.
Exactly. Starship is designed to lift 100,000 to 150,000 kilograms to LEO. That's a city bus. That massive capacity lets you spread all your fixed cost salaries, ground systems, licenses over a huge amount of mass. It gives you economies of scale that legacy rockets just can't touch.
And the third driver is more of a philosophy. It's this idea of first principles engineering combined with something called the idiot index. That's a fascinating internal metric.
It's a profound shift from how aerospace usually works. First principles thinking means you ignore how it's been done before, and you start from the fundamental laws of physics. The idiot index is a way to check yourself. It compares the cost of your finished product to the cost of the raw materials that went into it.
And in traditional aerospace, that ratio must be insane, using custom aluminum alloys or carbon fiber.
Ridiculously high. And that comparison is what drove the very non-traditional decision to build Starship out of cheap commodity stainless steel.
Stainless steel. That just seems so counterintuitive for a giant rocket. Why is that an advantage besides just being cheap?
Well, it's cheap, it's durable, and you can manufacture it easily. You can weld it quickly on a factory floor, which slashes fabrication costs. But crucially, it performs incredibly well at both cryogenic temperatures, super cold, and extremely high temperatures during re-entry. That simplifies the whole thermal protection system. By choosing a cheap, tough material, they streamlined the whole production line and avoided the kind of cost overruns that plagued traditional government programs for decades.
And this revolution, driven by freedom and efficiency, it's forced the traditional players, like ULA, to innovate like crazy just to stay in the game.
It's the competitive ripple effect. ULA is phasing out its expensive legacy rockets, the Atlas V and Delta III, and they're developing the Vulcan, and has its own really innovative approach to reusability. They aren't trying to recover the whole first stage.
No, they're just trying to catch the engines, right?
Just the engines. It sounds like something out of a James Bond movie. The engines, which are about 2/3 of the first stage's cost, detach, deploy an inflatable heat shield, and then descend under a giant parafoil. And the plan is to literally catch them in midair with a helicopter.
That sounds incredibly complex.
The complexity is immense, but it's a strategic trade-off. It allows them to get partial reusability while still maximizing the rocket's payload capacity.
But the real gem in ULA's future plan seems to be this advanced cryogenic evolved stage, or ACES. That sounds like a whole different kind of capability.
It is. ACS is this innovative, long-duration upper stage. It's designed to operate in space for weeks or even months at a time, which is a capability nobody else is even close to mastering. Traditional upper stages, even on reusable rockets, they're dead in hours. Their batteries run out, and their cryogenic propellant just boils off into space.
So how does ACS stay alive for so long?
They solved the boil-off and power problems with internal combustion engines, like in a car. ACS replaces the traditional systems with these engines that burn the tiny amount of oxygen and hydrogen that boils off from the main tanks.
So it's a closed loop. It's using its own waste product as fuel.
It's an ingenious system. It handles attitude control, tank pressurization, and most importantly, it generates electricity indefinitely. This creates this powerful, long-duration platform for deep space missions, for building orbital refueling depots. It's a capability far beyond what conventional upper stages can do. It's ULA's unique strategic answer to the Starship disruption. They're focusing on long-term orbital logistics, not just raw cost LEO.
That astronomical cost collapse you just detailed, it doesn't just make launch cheaper. It completely changes the economic equation for everything you put in orbit. We're shifting from what the sources called the mass paradigm to a new cost paradigm.
For decades, launch cost was the absolute king. Every single satellite designer worked under the mass paradigm. Their primary goal was to make the satellite as light and as small as humanly possible, because the launch cost was the biggest part of the total capital expenditure, the CAPEX.
Which led to these incredibly complex, bespoke, and super expensive satellites.
Exactly. Now, with super heavy lift vehicles like Starship offering exponentially more capacity, we're talking 4 times the volume and mass of what came before, that constraint just vanishes. The new cost paradigm is totally different.
So what does that look like for a satellite designer today?
Well, since launch costs are plummeting, the incentive flips. It's no longer about optimizing for mass. It's about reducing the manufacturing cost. The new design philosophy is basically heavy, simple, and cheap.
You can trade inexpensive mass for expensive complexity?
Precisely. Instead of spending months trying to shave off a few ounces with exotic materials, designers can now ask, how can we simplify this? How can we use cheaper parts and just add more shielding or more redundancy?
So give us some concrete examples of those trade-offs. Where can you add mass to save money?
The biggest gains are in avionics. Traditionally, space-qualified computer chips are prohibitively expensive. They have to be custom-made to be radiation-hardened. In the new paradigm, you can replace those costly chips with mass-produced, off-the-shelf components, maybe from the automotive industry, which is highly reliable but way cheaper.
And since you can afford the extra weight, you just protect those cheaper chips with heavy radiation shielding.
Yeah, you're essentially using cheap, heavy armor to protect cheap, mass-produced brains. It's a fascinating trade-off. And you see it elsewhere, too.
Where else?
In the structure and power systems. You can use less mass-optimized structures, thicker components, simpler bracing, which are way faster and cheaper to build. For power, you can move away from the most exotic solar cells and use standard silicone-based ones and cheaper, heavier batteries. Our analysis shows you can cut manufacturing costs by up to 40% just by doubling the satellite's mass while keeping the same performance. It's the definition of a low-cost, heavy design.
And which types of space systems benefit the most from this?
Low Earth orbit, or LEO, constellations. They benefit the most, and it's mostly because of their cost structure. The capex for a LEO constellation is basically two big buckets: building the satellites and launching the satellites. And in LEO, the launch cost has always been a much bigger percentage of the total cost compared to higher orbits like MEO or GEO.
So if the launch cost drops by a factor of 4,000, LEO systems feel that impact way more than a big GEO satellite.
Exactly. Retrospective modeling confirms it.
Yeah.
LEO architecture saw potential total capex reductions of 18% to 36% when you modeled the switch from Falcon 9 pricing to projected Starship pricing. For some of those big, expensive GEO satellites, the savings weren't as transformative because the satellites themselves are already so expensive and they often wouldn't even use the full capacity of a Starship launch. It strongly suggests that these SHLVs are going to accelerate the global shift toward these massive LEO constellations.
And beyond just making existing constellations cheaper, this cheap mass unlocks entirely new businesses. Let's talk about how this finally makes true wideband direct-to-device or D2D services possible.
The D2D market connecting satellites directly to your normal cell phone has always been limited by physics, specifically by the link budget equation. That's the formula that governs how strong the signal is when it gets to the tiny antenna in your phone. And historically, the launch constraints on mass and volume severely limited the satellite. You just couldn't make the antennas big enough or the transmitters powerful enough.
And that limitation meant that D2D providers had to focus on these niche, low-bandwidth services.
Right. The current D2D solutions, like basic emergency texting, are narrowband services. They often deliver less than 10 kilobits per second to a user. That's enough for an SMS, but it's nothing like modern communication. The satellite is constrained, so the service is constrained.
But with cheap, massive launch capacity, you can completely change the variables in that link budget equation.
The relaxation of those launch constraints lets designers do things that were impossible before. You can mount much larger, higher-gain antennas on the satellites. You can increase the transmitter power since you can afford heavier, more robust power systems. And you can even place the satellites in lower orbits, which dramatically cuts down on the signal loss.
And all of that adds up to a much stronger signal at your phone. What does that do to the actual service capacity?
It takes the service from being a niche emergency product to a true wideband capability. You shift from less than 10 kilobps to services that can provide 2 to 5 megabits per second per user. That's enough for web browsing, for voice calls, even for streaming video.
That's the crucial leap.
It is. It moves satellite communication from a specialized industry for remote places to a mass market complement for regular cell networks, serving millions of people at once. The economic impact of that kind of global connectivity is just transformative.
It's important to ground all this high-level strategy in the industrial reality of how these rockets are actually being built. There's this anecdote in our sources about a welder on the Starbase factory floor that just paints a perfect picture.
Yeah, the welder wasn't talking about bespoke clean room engineering. He was talking about building a railroad to the sky. The whole philosophy is ultra low cost and super high iteration. They use rough, durable commodity steel, not million-dollar composites. They build, they break, they learn, and they build again. They accept the local costs, like having to rebuild a launch pad, because the eventual payoff is an exponentially lower operating cost that enables this entire new economic paradigm.
That focus on cost reduction is incredibly powerful, but the economic modeling we reviewed shows that you have to balance that raw cost cutting against longevity. You can't sacrifice the satellite's lifetime just to make it cheap.
That is the critical economic lesson for the operators. We saw Monte Carlo simulations that looked at this complex trade-off between manufacturing cost, launch cost, and how long the satellite actually lasts in orbit. And while that low-cost, heavy approach is very competitive, that economic advantage just collapses if the satellite lifetime is too short.
Why does asset life matter so much if launch is cheap? Can't you just launch replacements?
Because the ultimate metric of success is your capex per megabit per second per month. The longer that asset is reliably working in orbit, the better that metric gets. If you're constantly having to launch replacements for short-lived satellites, you're not just paying for launch, you're paying for continuous manufacturing and deployment, and that negates the savings.
So the lesson for designers is?
The lesson is you have to dedicate part of that extra mass you get from SHLVs, the weight you saved by simplifying the design, and reinvest it into maintaining or improving the subsystem redundancy and the overall asset life. A disposable design philosophy is only viable if launch costs hit the absolute rock bottom, and even then, long asset life is economically superior.
This entire deep dive has really been a look at this unavoidable tension at the very core of human progress. You have the undeniable economic and really existential need to break out of this closed system and achieve off-world growth versus the ideological and bureaucratic stagnation imposed by extreme risk aversion and regulatory safetyism.
We've established that the basic math of a closed system guarantees eventual stagnation and decline. That makes expansion a survival imperative, and we've quantified the disruption. Private sector freedom has driven launch costs down by thousands of times, enabling entirely new industries, from the mass-to-cost paradigm shift to the birth of true global communication. And yet the entire project is still being held back by a philosophy that equates a temporary local disruption with a species-level catastrophe.
The sources really suggest this choice boils down to a fundamental acceptance of risk versus the anxiety of stagnation. You can choose the anxiety of staying here, confined to a depleted, closed system that guarantees decline, or you can accept the necessary local costs and the temporary risks that are just inherent in building a truly free industrial expansion to the stars.
And that perspective, that acceptance, it's often best articulated not by the billionaires, but by the people working closest to the hardware, the industrial workforce. There's the story of Elias, a retired terrestrial miner. He spent 30 years watching the closed system in action, watching ore grades diminish and seeing inevitable layoffs. For him, that colossal stainless steel rocket wasn't noise pollution or a billionaire's toy.
It was something else.
It was the physical key to unlocking potentially infinite resources from the asteroid belt. He understood that staying in the cradle wasn't the safe option. It was just slow suffocation disguised as stasis. For Elias, when those Raptor engines roared to life, it wasn't noise pollution. It was the sound of the entire human economy trying to breathe again.